Okay, good morning. We continue our journey in Ayin Beis, volume 3, up to page 1423. Sorry, 1423. Okay. So let's refresh since we're coming from Passover. I hope everybody had a great Passover. Let's just refresh what we've been learning, and then we can continue on. So the immediate theme is the explanation of the Maimer Chazal, of the statement from our sages, Kol hamayruch be'echad, one who prolongs or extends, when they say Echad in the prayer, in the Shema. So the explanation he's giving here, what does that prolonging consist of? It consists of a contemplation that is prolonged. There is an interpretation that the Echad is actually prolonged. You say the Echad, especially the Daled, the word itself is pronounced in an extended way, in a prolonged way. But the explanation here and in other places is that it's the contemplation in a prolonged fashion, that you don't just say the words and give it quick thought. You extend and expand and prolong the contemplation on what this Echad is. And this was in context why the Rebbe Rashab began discussing this, because that followed, just to give us again the flow here, what he said earlier, a different Maimer Chazal, Kol ha'eina amin yehesh me'rabba b'chol keichei, that someone that answers amin yehesh me'rabba with all his might, with all his strength, they abolishes all the harsh decrees. It abolishes the harsh decree. And the Rebbe Rashab explained that idea, that that's because Kol Keiche he interpreted in two ways. Kol Keiche means with all the Kayach, with the word Kayach, 28, that there's the number 28, Kayach Maisav, that's invested in creation. And then there's Va'ata Yigdal Na Koyach Adnai, that we strengthen and empower that Koyach by drawing from the divine that's higher than creation. What he said from Atik, a higher level, the level that's higher than five, the 5 fingers, which is the 28 joints on the hands. So we draw from a level that's even higher than that, and that's from the G'toiv, that the Hashem that's higher, Atik, from Atzilus and Sof, that's higher than the divine within existence. A second interpretation called Keiche is B'chol Kavanose. So to explain with all his intention. What is intention? And that's called Hamayruch Be'echad. What is the intention? So it's not just the Koyach as in connected to a divine revelation that's higher than the revelation within existence, but B'chol Kavanose. And with that, he began to explain what's the kavana. The kavana is the arichus and echad, which we'll soon discuss exactly what that means, that contemplation. But I was just first giving the context. Now, why was he speaking about the chol keiche? Because he was talking about who, drawing down from a level called who, which is higher than existence. Because remember, the theme of Ayin Beis is the interface between the divine that transcends existence with the divine within existence. So he was discussing that there are 3 stages. There's Mamala Kalam, divine within existence, like Mamchol Levavcha, V'hafta Shankach B'chol Levavcha. Then there's B'chol Nafshach Mesiris Nefesh, Sevav Kalam, transcendence. And then there's even higher level, who, that's higher, the real who, that's Atik, that's higher altogether, like Etzem, like Atzmusei called it the Etzem, or Shemaya Atzmi, the core name of the divine as it's rooted in the source, that is higher than both the Mamala and Seviv, which is the ultimate connection. And this has been part of the discussion that's been going back, let's see here, from page 1411, essentially. And that itself came to follow after he's been discussing Ishen Einai, the pupil of the eye, that souls are rooted in that place, in Shemaya Atzmi. So even though the souls, when they come down below, require Torah Ur, the light of Torah as a siyua, as a support, to be able to illuminate this world, but the souls as they are in their root are even higher than Torah, as we've been discussing, and I go back now all the way to this idea began on page 1398. So that's the flow of what we've been learning here. Now it goes back, obviously, we start connecting it backwards. The idea is before, but I want to just, I'll suffice with what I've said. Yeah. And this goes back to what we've been discussing in this whole section. Torah, in contrast to Tefillah. Tefillah is Aramim Kaya Melech from the bottom up, where you elevate the divine within existence all the way up to Remus to Keser, to transcendence. Torah, you draw down from Aramim from the top down. You're drawing down that power all the way from the highest levels down into existence, which is the main point that he's really discussed that began in 1350. Okay. Yeah, 1350. Now, to bring it back to where we are now, so what does this contemplation consist of? What does it consist of? So, I'm going to review now the pages from page 1417 to where we are up to now, 1423, the last 6 pages. So he explained what is the kavanah. It's a long discussion of understanding what is Shmoy. When you say Hashem Echad, Shmoy Echad, what is a name? And that name, that will help us understand the word Echad as it applies to the name. So the name, briefly, is another word for Oir, for Gilui, for revelation, for expression. So Havai Echad refers to God, and Shmoy Echad refers to divine expression. Because if there was no divine expression, there'd be no existence. So the first thing God chose was to express himself. Didn't have to express himself. God built a Metzias Nimtza, could be completely beyond revelation, beyond beyond shame. He doesn't need a name. But he wanted an existence. He wanted to have a dira b'tachtenim, a home in this world. He wanted an existence as it exists now. So the first step is Oir, which in Kabbalah is the name that Chazal call it shame, as he explained, as I said, on page 1417. And when we say a Shmoy Echad, we're saying that also his expression is one and connected with the divine source. So to explain that, he discussed what is a name. When you break it down, a name is made up of letters. When you say expression, to express something, you need to have letters. You need to have words. So he went through a whole discussion, a long discussion, where our words originate from. So when you have words of speech, they're rooted in words of thought, which are less tangible. The words of thought originate in the letters within the mind, in Bina, and then even higher in Chachma, and then even higher in Ratzon and Tainug, all the way in Keser, and all the way to the Oisius as they are, only as potential expressions, the names of the divine before the Tzimtzum, which means it leaves room for expression, but it's not yet an expression, meaning it's not yet a defined entity. But God is allowing himself, like he said in the Sinus Mokum. So bottom line is, when we talk about existence being created by God's words, with Dvar Havaya, Shemayim Nasu, that with the words of God, the word of God, the heaven was created. The same thing with Hasara Maimoris, Nivra Elam. Everything in existence created through God's words. These words, when we contemplate on them, and that's the Ma'ariv Be'echad, take us all the way back to their source, and they're rooted there, not only rooted there, but they're one, they're fundamentally one with the source itself. So Hamayir Be'echad consists of contemplating the divine within existence, is really a reflection that's rooted all the way back into the very source. And the example he was giving, the operative example, is the words that we use. When I'm speaking right now, these words originate in my thought. The thought originates in Bina, into Chachma, all the way into the Ratzon and Tainug, all the way into the Etzem HaNefesh, like he explained, the letters and words originate in the core soul. However, they're completely sublime. They're completely submerged and don't have any definition. So Ma'ariv Be'echad is essentially connecting the divine that manifests in a very tangible way in existence, Mamala Karalman, all the way to its source, where it's completely submerged and sublimated in that source. That's in brief what he's been discussing the last 6 pages from 1417, and we are now at 1423. Now the details is really where it becomes the real arichus, the mayrich, the extension, the prolonged contemplation is the whole details, all the way as we discussed it first after the tzimtzum, ta'ak, then going all the way to before the tzimtzum, shmoy, all the way to the level of shmoy, shem is plural, then there was shem echad, one name, but it's still the level of a name, a gilui. Then there's how it's rooted in the etzem ha'ir, there's no gilui altogether, and then there's how the etzem is neisei, carries the potential, the actualize, the capacity to reveal himself. And all that is part of the process, because it originates in the etzem, and that's the contemplation. So on page 1421, he went back and said, Al Piha now, we'll understand Amayrik be'echad, what does it mean to prolong the contemplation on the word echad? And he explained, because as the Gemara says there, that when a person essentially establishes the sovereignty of God, Lamailo Lamata, Echad is Ches and Daled. The seven heavens and earth is 8, and the 4 directions is the Daled, and connects that the details to the Aleph of Echad. So they're basically demonstrating how all the multitudes of existence are really rooted in a oneness and a singularity of the divine essence, and that's what the contemplation consists of. And then he goes on to explain this contemplation as we go from speech to thought, all the way to bina, to ideas, as we understand them in detail, chachma, which is far less tangible, it's just a spark, all the way into keser, which is like the superconscious, all the way to the etzem, that's higher than keser, that's all the atik in keser, all the way to before the tzimtzum. That page 1421, 1422. Now, one more piece to add. So how then do the letters manifest? Why do they start taking on shape and form if they originate in a place that's higher than shape and form in the source? The answer is the tzimtzumim. That God applies his power of concealment to allow the letters to emerge. Because as long as the eir is completely dominant, there won't be any room for any tangible, defined entities. So he explains that these tzimtzumim only affect the recipient, us. But from a divine perspective, there's no tzimtzumim merak l'gaba ilmus. But l'gaba Hashem, there's no tzimtzumim. And that's also part of the contemplation, understanding existence through the eyes and lens of God. And when you understand that, you come to realize that all these levels that are all real and allow existence to be, however, from God's perspective, are not really concealments at all. They're just ways for him to express himself. So we see the world as an entity, as an identity, and an ego, and and its own consciousness. God sees the world as an expression of himself. However, it's not an expression of all of him, because obviously God is higher, and the essence of God is not defined by being a creator. But nevertheless, all of existence is essentially God's words. God is the author. These are his words. God is the artist. This is his art. And that's part of the contemplation. As he concludes on top of page 1423, where we stopped before Pesach, he says, and when you contemplate on that, you come to realize that from God's perspective, the truth is everything is nullified. Everything is nullified, and it's all encompassed within his essence, just as before it was created. That's how God sees existence. So then what is existence itself? That's God leaving room for existence. So from God's perspective, he leaves room for existence, and that's what we're contemplating on as we climb from the bottom up and retrace the steps of how existence came to be. Basically, we're going from creation to the creator, understanding the process of how this existence was rooted and began its origins all the way in levels that are before and prior to existence. So we say Hashem Echad, Ushma Echad, we're essentially saying not just God is one, but also his expression, all the way down to the level of words that create existence are really one and the same oneness as they are in the source. That's where we stopped. We began reading the next paragraph, but I'm going to start from the new paragraph on page 1423. So that's a summary of what we've been learning. And I'm going to continue reading now. So if you go to page 1423, the new paragraph, we'll start from there. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Just because we haven't been, since we've been away since before the holiday, maybe if someone wants to refresh anything or have any clarification points to clarify or any questions, please do so before I start reading on. So the new paragraph on page 1423. V'zehu kol ha'mayich be'echad. And this, what is this referring to? The previous 6 pages, especially the previous 2 pages from 1417, and then especially from 1421, the whole contemplation that I just summarized. That's kol ha'mayich be'echad, hainu, which means, what means the mayruch be'echad, the prolonging, the extension, the extended echad? Hainu, that means shem is beinen, that he contemplates. The person who's saying echad is contemplating eich shekol ha'nivroim, how all creations, all of the creatures, everything in existence, sheisavusum b'chinas dibur elyon, which are created from dibur elyon, the supernal speech, God speaking. And that itself, those words that God spoke to create existence, are the light and reflection that extends. Remember the expression, and extends from their source, that draws them out, ma'ayin liyesh, from a state of non-existence to yesh, to a defined existence. That's the level of dibur elyon. Just like when we speak, we're taking ideas that are amorphous within ourselves and giving it tangible expression. The same thing God does it that way. He does not need to do it that way, but he wants us to understand the process. As a matter of fact, the reason we do it that way is because God did it that way. That's how he created the process. As he explains in Shar Yichud Amuna, the second part of Tanya, chapter 3, that essentially everything in existence is the word of God that's rooted in the source. So now he's saying, what's the contemplation consist of? Now that we've established that these are the words that the divine words that create existence, so he says, so the mizbein is eich shekol ha'nivroim, all these creations that are created from speech, they're encompassed and united. In other words, they're not just outer expressions that have no connection or a very loose or superficial connection with their source. No, they're encompassed, more than just encompassed and submerged. But miyuchadim, they're united and unified with the supernal thought of God. So it's not just words that God released and said, okay, you create existence. These words, the contemplation we're talking about, mayruch be'echad, begins with taking the words that God used, Yehi Eir, Yehi Rakia. But God said, let there be light, let there be a heaven, let there be vegetation. All the 10 different statements. And as the Alter Rebbe explains in Shaykh L'Amunah, that those 10 encompass, the letters encompass every possibility, all the different permutations and all the different connections that create everything in existence. So even though it doesn't say in the 10 Asara Mamoris, Even, that God created a stone, but Even is made up of 3 Hebrew letters that come from the 10 statements. So everything comes from there, he says, so they're klulim u'miyachodim, they're encompassed and connected with God's thought. So to use a very simple example that I've been using throughout Ayin Beis, when you look at the art of an artist, So you can see the art separate from the artist. But when you start contemplating, like in this case, you say, 1 second, this art was created by an artist. So when he actually made all these different items, they were first encompassed in his thought. He first thought about it. And this thought, it was far more what's the word I want to use? Far more integrated. And then we're going to learn how the mind is rooted even deeper in the higher levels as we go through this contemplation. The difference is in a human being, the art indeed is separate from the artist. If it comes to existence, as he explains in Shayachet Vamuna, we just don't see the divine within the art because it's concealed from us. But the art itself is really just an expression of divine words. So we are contemplating how it's not just the words of God, but they are miyuchadim. They're klul mechadim chinas machshav yaina shari eisha er. Because that very energy, the way it was first in God's thought, when he thought about it before he spoke. Because the truth, it's radiating begili in a revealed way, also in speech. When I'm speaking right now, you're not just hearing my words, you're also hearing my thoughts. If I didn't speak, the thoughts would remain concealed from another, from you. But when I speak, my speech is not disconnected from my thoughts. The speech is revealing what is in the thoughts. So the truth is that the same energy that's in the thought is now radiating gam b'chinas adibur, rak hein gvirose. However, gvirose is barach. However, it's coming in a diminished way because these are part of God's gvuras. This is God's power to conceal. To conceal the energy from the nivraim, the creations. In other words, as much as he's expressing himself in words, he's also concealing. Even though it's originating and the thought is being expressed through the words from his perspective, God's perspective, the thought is completely there, but he's also exercising certain element of refrain and concealment. Shawat, that they shouldn't feel this energy. That's why we can exist, because we're not completely consumed and we don't feel that we're completely submerged in the source. So in essence, saying that when the words of speech express the divine, but express them in a way that allows room for existence to have its independent consciousness. Like he writes in Shari Yechud V'Amuna and Tanya, that he just referred to chapter 4. So in chapter 3, he talks about how it's all the letters of God, but in chapter 4, he talks about the Tzimtzum. Be'inyan Hagadol of Hagibur. He speaks Hagadol, that God is called Hagadol, the Great One. That's God's power to reveal. And then God's Hagibur, God's power as a strong one. Gibur is referring to Gvura, his power to conceal. So actually, creation is a combination of God's power to reveal, but also to conceal. So he's revealing divine energy to create, but he's revealing it in a concealed way that exists, the consciousness of existence, to not feel that energy, so they can exist as an independent entity. Both are divine. As we said, the Tzimtzum does not affect God; it only affects us. But both divine energies, as he explains in Shari Yechud V'Amuna, that's what he calls Hein V'Reisa. The concealment is also godly energy, except we don't see it because that's what power is, to conceal. But it's also divine energy. When you contemplate on all this, you come to Ayin Beis, you realize that there's the divine unity is there both in the revelation of existence and the concealment is also divine. All that's part of the contemplation that he's discussing. Aval be'emes, though it's concealed from us, but in truth, the way it is from God's perspective. In God's perspective, the Eir and Gili, the revelation, and the energy of the Machshava is radiating also in the Dibur. Except we, the recipient, doesn't feel that. But from God's perspective, the truth is that it is radiating there. So what do we derive from this? That there's no separation. Like he brought in the previous page, remember Hurmiz and Ar Hurmiz, where he said there's a separation. That which belongs to one, to heaven, doesn't belong on earth. That which is on earth doesn't belong in heaven, which is essentially declaring a state of duality, God forbid. And the answer is no, Ma'irich be'echad, echad. That the divine as it is above, that's how it is below, and how it's below, that's how it is above. And that's our contemplation, that though we see existence, and on our own, we may think that it's a separate entity of the divine. No, it comes from the letters of speech that are rooted in the thought, and it's all one within the thought from God's perspective. So Akol Kol Machshav El Yena. And that's this first step of the contemplation of Amayrik Be'echad. Now he's going to move further from thought to the faculties. Remember, Machshav is still a levush, it's still conscious thought. It's just a revelation to yourself, not to another. But before the revelation of thought comes the very faculties in the example of a human being, and the divine, we're talking now levels that are far more than beyond expression even, which is the next stage. But I'll stop here if anybody wants any clarification of what we learned so far. So he's really said more or less this earlier, but now he's spelling it out in very, very specific terms, what the contemplation consists of.
Rabbi, so like we are existing, quote unquote, always within God's thought then, like,
yeah.
And we're supposed, and the way to connect with Hashem is to just dwell on that thought that we are constantly within there.
Yes, that's what he's referring to. Remember, he's not talking here about mitzvahs and other ways of doing it. He's talking here on the contemplation of Echad. That's why Shema, Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad is such a critical and important prayer, the cornerstone of all liturgy, of all Judaism. So he's explaining what that unit, what does it mean? Why are we saying God is one? And we're really saying that all of existence dwells, as you just put it, in God's thought. But it continues, it goes deeper. Because thought too is still an expression, it's just an expression to himself. But you said it accurately.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now comes the next step. We're moving from the bottom up, meaning existence. Now existence is in the expression of divine words, supernal speech, which is rooted in supernal thought and encompassed in there. Then he goes on. Ukamoy and so too, Hamachshava Elyena, the higher thought, God's supernal thought, his thinking about existence, is not the beginning of the process. When we think, we become conscious of our ideas. But before thought comes the very ideas themselves within our faculties, even when we're not conscious of them. So he says the same thing above. Just as the dibur, the speech, is rooted and encompassed and one with a thought, so the machshav al-yena, the higher supernal thought, plula, the b'chinas mideisav yizbarach, that's encompassed in God's attributes. Ub'chinas chabad, and in God's mind. So midas is chagasim, the spheres. I'm going to explain this in a moment. Let me just spell it out. So the midas is chagas, nehim, chesed, gvur, teferes, netzach, chayd, yesed, malchut, the 7 emotions, and chabad, chachma, bina, das. So the best example for this would be, again, going back to our flesh. From my flesh I behold God. Let's just use ourselves as an example. Very important, this point. Thought, speech, and action, as he explains in Tanya, are 3 garments. Why are they called garments? Levushim. Because a garment is not part of who you actually are. You put on a jacket, a shirt, pants, or any garment, skirt, whatever it may be. It's a garment. It's not made of you. It's not like your skeleton, which is very much part of your very body. It's definitely not part of your soul. So what exactly is the role of thought, speech, and action? So think about it for a moment. If you had nothing to think about, and nothing to speak about, and nothing to act on, they'd just be like garments hanging in a closet. They're not expressing anything. On the other hand, when fed and energized by the faculties of the soul, our mind, our emotions, let's say chachma, bina, or chesed, kindness, word, discipline, then the garments play a critical role. They express those faculties. What would the faculties be without the garments? That would be like a locked soul that couldn't express itself. Thought reveals consciously the ideas in your mind and the feelings in your heart to yourself. Dibur expresses it to someone else. Maisa creates something, either in writing or you build something based on it. So the garments without faculties are just empty garments. The faculties without garments are concealed and remain in a latent or dormant state. So machshava, dibur, maisa is actual process of expression. But you have to express something. So in a way, we call them levushim, even though you can also define them as containers. But for all practical purposes, levushim is the right way to define them. So even though dibur is God's speech, and dibur is connected with God's thought, but it's still expressions of divine. One to himself, which created, if you remember, the concealed worlds, and one to other, which is creating the revealed worlds. But machshava and dibur have a place where they originate from, and that's the faculties. In this case, the divine faculties. So if you had the 10 spheres, and you didn't have machshava, dibur, and maisa, of course, you just have 10 attributes, like 10 building blocks. So now he's saying that the expression of speech, which is encompassed within and submerged and united with thought, so too the thought is encompassed and united with its source, which are the divine attributes. The divine attributes, emotional ones, and the divine intellectual, cognitive attributes. So now we've so far covered like this. The letters and words create existence, Bria, Yitzir, Asiya. They are encompassed in God's thought, which in turn are encompassed in God's faculties and attributes in Atzilus. And now he's going to go back, further back. V'chein, and so too, next step. Hiskalus Atzilus, b'madrega shalamaylam Atzilus. Because Atzilus, even though we just explained these are attributes, and without the garments of thought and speech, they don't have expression, but they are attributes. Even when you're not thinking or speaking, even when you're asleep, you're a functioning entity that has attributes. Your mind is there, your emotions are there, they're just not being expressed. So Atzilus, at the end of the day, is an entity. And now Atzilus originates to then what's higher than Atzilus. Before it became a defined entity of 10 spheres, the 10 revealed spheres, the 3 cognitive ones, and the 7 emotional ones that he just mentioned. So now comes the next step in the contemplation. The first step was speech, and everything comes from the words of speech, which are encompassed in thought, and one with the thought, with God's thought. The thought is encompassed within the faculties or the attributes. The attributes in Atzilus are now encompassed. Iskalus, Atzilus, really, where does it originate from? From higher than Atzilus, which now we're already talking beyond consciousness, beyond the garments for sure, but beyond even the consciousness of the faculties. Ad, all the way up, and now he's not elaborating as much as he did earlier because he's relying that he already made this case in the last 6 pages. But now he says, Ad, all the way till because remember, even higher than Atzilus is still after the Tzimtzum. So it's true, it's super consciousness like Keser, and it's beyond the defined faculties, but it's still in some type of entity, as we learned. Till we reach before the Tzimtzum, which was before God even put this into place. Now we're talking about in God envisioning the whole thing, before there was Dibur and Machshava, and even before their faculties, and even before their superconscious faculties. Shaligabe. Because from God's perspective, Einat Tzimtzum Milo Master Klal, as we learned. Even the Tzimtzum is not conceal or cover up anything. Umeir Ein Sof Begilui, and from God's perspective, the Ein Sof, the infinite divine, not just the faculties of Atzilus, the attributes, not just higher than Atzilus. But even the Ein Sof, that was before God even began to envision existence, radiates la'acharat Tzimtzum k'may koydem Tzimtzum canal. So pre-Tzimtzum consciousness radiates, and pre-Tzimtzum reality radiates in the post-Tzimtzum consciousness canal, as we discussed earlier. So in this contemplation, as we said, we're going not just from the words of speech to thought, and from thought to the attributes or the faculties, from the faculties to the superconscious faculties. We're going all the way to the divine itself before anything emerged, as we learned. And from his perspective, and this is all part of our contemplation, it's all one. Even though it went through all these gradations in order to create existence. That's what Echad is telling us. That's the Ma'irich B'Echad. That's the contemplation, the prolonged contemplation in Echad. V'im came. So based on this, that the speech is encompassed in the thought in the faculties and the attributes in Atzilus higher than to higher Atzilus, all the way to the Eireh before the Tzimtzum, Im came. So the contemplation concludes, if that's the case, Hakil Kol Be'ed Ein Sof K'mosh Kodim Shenisava. Everything in existence really is all standing within, submerged within, encompassed within Ein Sof, the way before it was created. So the contemplation is essentially saying what you see as creation, which is real, is really godly divine expression that is rooted all the way in the highest levels of the divine Pre-Tzimtzum. So it's not a duality. Not just not a duality, God forbid, that there's God and existence. But it's even the divine within existence is really one with the divine beyond existence. That's the real chiddush here. To say that God is everywhere and it's not pantheism, that's obvious. Hashem Echad is much more than that. Echad is saying that the divine within existence is really exactly as it is the divine prior to existence. From the point of view of the artist, or I would say God before he's an artist, the art and his ability to be an artist and all the faculties and everything we discussed is all exactly one with the way he is in his core essence. The only thing is he's not defined by it because he's far beyond existence, as we learned earlier. But whatever existence is just really an expression of divine. Now, each one of us has to figure out what level we're on to be able to appreciate, because for us, the mere fact to understand that existence is not a self-made reality, but an expression of divine is already an accomplishment. To go through all these levels, that's the Ma'irich B'Echad. And you can imagine people who have been doing this all their lives, every day in Shema, have reached levels of very high levels of sublimation, of being absorbed in these deeper levels. But the point is, what we have here is a framework that each of us can employ in our avodah, in our work, in our contemplation, in our prayer of understanding existence as it is first from our perspective and then from divine perspective. Because this is a heavy piece, again, I'll pause and stop if anybody wants me to clarify. There's more to come. He's still spelling out different things that we've learned and just elaborating upon. So it's not finished yet. When we finish, when we finish the subject, obviously I'll sum it all up then. So there's more to cover, but still, I think it's good to pause and stop if anybody wants me to ask. If anybody wants to ask anything. Okay. So let's continue on. And again, he's referring to words and ideas he's already said earlier as he built the case. What the Rebbe Rashab is really doing now is really tying it all together in what the contemplation consists of. So really, to understand this well, you really have to go back over the last 6 pages, which I summed up before, but I would advise, if you really want to appreciate it, go back to 1417 when you have a chance and just browse through it or read through it or learn it properly. We did that already, but it'd be worthwhile. I will do the same, obviously, because it's all part of understanding this. But so now he adds one more thing in the parentheses, which he already said at the end of the last paragraph. I think it's a very fascinating piece. I've not seen it anywhere else in Chassidus, quite spelled out like this. It's always suggested like in innuendos and between the lines, but this is the only place if I recall correctly, where the Rebbe Rashab in a mimer is spelling out this line. So let's read it, the parentheses. So everything is encompassed in Ein Sof, but you still have to deal with one thing here. We're not dealing with an illusion. We're not saying existence is an illusion. In other words, like a magic trick, a sleight of hand, that God concealed his presence and allows us to think there's an existence. And in truth, there's no existence altogether. Because hypothetically, you could argue that this whole thing is just a mirage. And when you really discover the deeper truth of what's behind it, it's God's hands. It's like exactly like a magician. Makes a trick. You think it's real. He brings and then you find out the whole thing was a projection. But we can't say that because Bereshis bara Elokim, God created heaven and earth. That's not an illusion. And Torah and mitzvahs that we do in this world are not an illusion. And when you eat matzah on Pesach, you do other mitzvahs, you're doing something. If you say it's all an illusion, then what's the purpose of it all? As we said earlier, it's really a combination of two realities. One is revelation to create. The other is the concealment is for us to see ourselves as if we're independent realities. So the independent reality is also not an illusion because we actually are given free will. And we're given that sense because God is concealing himself. And as we said, the concealment itself is a divine power. Concealment is not just a concealment, it's creating something that exists. So then how do we explain existence from God's perspective? Because if you say that Tzimtzum doesn't have any impact, as he's been saying, so how do you explain it? So he said earlier, and he's saying it now again. Rakshu b'chinas nesinas makim. The divine in existence from God's perspective is that I am considering and giving room for something to exist. So the mere fact that God says, when I say the word says, I'm just using it as a word because he didn't speak yet, as we've been discussing. But the mere fact that God is wishing and desiring existence means that even though God is beyond existence, he's leaving room for it. Remember we said about Shemus. What is a name? God doesn't need a name. But by allowing himself having a name, he's saying, I'm leaving room. Nesinas mokim. So it's going back on page 1420. That I can be called a chazdan, someone who does kindness. I can be called a chacham. There's no chacham yet. There's no wisdom and there's no chesed yet. But God is allowing himself. So he says that's existence from God's perspective. He's allowing himself, his saying, I'm going to engage in creation because to do gibur, gvura, tzimtzum also requires desire. It doesn't happen automatically. Just as God says, I want to reveal light and I want to create art, I also need to exercise another attribute, and that's the attribute of concealment. But God is beyond concealment and is beyond revelation, as we said, but he chooses to manifest in these forms. So therefore, the Nesinas Mokim, that's how God sees existence, that he's engaging in that. We see existence as an independent entity. God sees existence as my wish to create something that will feel itself as independent. And both perspectives are true. That's the power of God. But in the contemplation of Ayin Beis is that we're coming to understand, not just from our perspective, that we are created by God and sustained by God, and we thank God, but actually that God has allowed within his own oneness and reality and his own field of energy, if you wish, in his own reality, he's allowed space and room for another entity. And that's the level of Elokim. Because Elokim is God as he manifests in Tzimtzum, in Helam, in Gvura, but it's Elokim as it's encompassed in Havaya. Ukamoshin is il, as was explained earlier. Because it's not Elokim as we see it, the divine that is creating existence, Elokim in Havaya that God wants to and is leaving room for existence. And that's where we meet. So based on this, you could then, of course, ask the question, what about God that's beyond leaving room for us for existence? Can we connect to that? And the answer is yes. I think he's going to say it explicitly. If not, I'll explain. Because right now, what we've done is we've removed our perspective, but we still need to have some relationship because we're not looking to annihilate human consciousness. We're not looking to annihilate existence consciousness. We're looking to understand the bigger picture that you only see the tip of the iceberg, how the divine manifests in speech, encompassed in thought. And now the contemplation is showing us that it's all really lying within the divine reality of before the Tzimtzum. So it's not annihilating it, it's just telling you the true full nature. It's like you only see the outer expression of it, and here we're contemplating and understanding its full picture. But it's still God leaving room for existence. So the question is, if we go higher than that, then there's no room for existence. Then we have to say that we become so absorbed that it's only the divine. And the answer is that we reach there too, but you can't go there if you don't first go through these stages. That's why you can't just jump from Dibur to Atzilus before the Tzimtzum. You have to go Dibur, speech, thought, the faculties, the attributes, higher than Atzilus, before the Tzimtzum as God relates to existence, and then all the way to the highest levels that we are going to reach and talk about shortly. I just wanted to add that point. Okay. So this is all part of the Kol HaMayrach Be'echad, the contemplation, the prolonged or extended contemplation on Echad, what that means. So the Ches and Daled refers to definitions of existence, structure, the seven heavens and earth. Dalet are the four directions of east, west, north, and south. And that's all part of the Aleph, the Echad, the Achdus that we're discussing here, how we are recognizing that integrated unity and singularity. And just for the record, as I mentioned a number of times, in many ways, this is exactly what scientists are trying to do. Trying to find the unified field theory, trying to find the unified, the laws. They unify all the fragments and all the divided elements of existence. So they've reached to the point that there's a strong force, a weak force, electromagnetism and gravity. The weak and the strong nuclear force, and the other two. Haven't yet reached that total unity. But in essence, what they're seeking is the same idea. What connects it all? How is it all rooted in one singularity, in one singular entity? Like we spoke about how everything originates in the development of a fetus that will give birth to a child. It all originates in one cell, as we discussed earlier. Okay. Any questions? So now the Rebbe Rashab continues in the contemplation. Now that we've spoken Shemizbainen, we go back to the first line of this paragraph. Shemizbainen Eich Shekolin Ivraim. So he's taken us that the contemplation consists of how all the creations which are rooted in speech are encompassed and united in thought, into the faculties, into higher than Atzilus, into Lifnei Tzimtzum, like we just discussed. It says, V'achar kach yizbainen, he continues. And after that contemplation, afterwards he contemplates, so the Mayrach continues. We're still prolonging our contemplation here. We're still extending it. Achar kach yizbainen, then he contemplates the Ein Sof Shel Lifnei Tzimtzum. Now that we reach the Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, the contemplation continues. The Prate Hamedregesh and is Bar Le'il. In Pre-Tzimtzum, there are also detailed levels that were discussed earlier. So that's also part of the contemplation. Till now, he's speaking about how we go speech, thought, before Atzilus, higher than Atzilus, into Pre-Tzimtzum. And now that we've reached Pre-Tzimtzum, which is all God's perspective, before creation, you're not talking about the artist before he's become an artist. Or even as he's an artist, but he's not yet created art. He's not yet created existence. So there are levels there too. So the contemplation consists of those levels as well. Shaze'in Ma'irich Be'echad. That's the Ma'irich Be'echad. He's now emphasizing Ma'irich Be'echad is not just the levels after the Tzimtzum. When we say Ma'irich Be'echad, we say, what is the Ma'irich? You mean a prolonged and extended contemplation? Means Lifnei Tzimtzum, because Lifnei Tzimtzum is the ultimate place, which you could basically say the whole, I don't want to call it the incubator, because it's not yet even an incubator, but that's where the whole manufacturing began, within the divine reality. The Mittler Rebbe has a sefer called Shari Yichud. In chapter 10, he says, Ma'irich Be'echad is referring to Lifnei Tzimtzum. Obviously, it's referring to everything we've discussed. But specifically now he's saying, you see that emphasis is Lifnei Tzimtzum. So in other words, it's not enough just to stop till the Tzimtzum and just generally speak about before the Tzimtzum. The contemplation should also include the levels in before the Tzimtzum itself. If you recall, we talked about 3 levels. Etzem ha'er, or even higher, Yechelis, Etzem ha'er, Hispashtus ha'er, and then God envisioning existence, meaning as he relates and begins envisioning the reality of existence. V'hainu, and he's spelling it out. So what does this contemplation before the Tzimtzum include? V'hainu, sheb'b'chinas alei sarotzen, the level of alei sarotzen is already, it arose in God's desire. If you remember, that's already a level which I believe he called Shmoi, Echad. And alei sarotzen, in that level where desire, he said, Shayachin Hasfiris. There you could talk about spheres. Shehein B'chinas, Esa Spheres Agnuzas. Those are the 10 hidden spheres that we learned about earlier on page 1420. Yeah. Which he referred to Shemes, plural. They're not actual spheres, as we discussed. They're names that give room for the spheres. So in that level itself, there's going to be several levels, if you recall. You remember he brought there the Pardes, if I recall. I'm just looking it up 1 second. Okay, he talked about the Pardes. 1 minute. Actually, I would go back a page before that as well. On page 1419. Just looking where he began to talk about this. Give me a moment. Trying to find the Pardes, but I think it's important here. Okay, yeah, it's those pages that I'm referring to. I just was looking for one thing. I don't see it right now, but I'm sure it'll come up. Oh yeah, right here on page 1422. So continuing the discussion before the Tzimtzum, I just said Aleisa Rotzen, that's where God is envisioning, or before envisioning, you can say leaving room for the 10 hidden spheres. So they're not actually spheres, they're just names that God is leaving room for that concept, for definitions. And even though it's before the Tzimtzum, there is the concept of Eris and Kalim. We just learned that on the previous page, 1422. We said, remember, Iyu v'garmui echad, Iyu garmui v'chayui v'garmuhi. Yeah. There's the place where God is envisioning existence. That's like the Kalim. There's a level where you can't even call it Kalim in definitions. It's just a state of Eris. The Iyu v'garmui echad. So remember, he said on that page I just referred to, he said, I'm reading from middle of 1422. So there's the concept of Eris and Kalim, and that too is part of this contemplation before the Tzimtzum. And the Iyu v'garmui echad, that God, He, and Garmui, you and your Kalim, or potential Kalim, Shein b'tachlis hayichud mamish, they're utterly united, Echad. Shein b'chinas mitzias klal l'klal. They're not at all in any form of existence. They're all part of divine energy. U'kanal, as was explained before, kamoi ha'esis shabeluchis. You remember there were the two levels of engraved letters that are in stone, but they're not through and through. So you compare that to the engraved letters of Keser and Ach after the Tzimtzum. But the engraved letters that are through and through, like in the tablets, he called that there where there's not even a shadow. It's like through and through, so it's all fully light, but it's still letters of light. That's like the letters that exist before the Tzimtzum. So it's all united. Even letters in stone are united with their source, with the stone, not like written letters that are ink on parchment, but especially letters through and through. That's what we learned earlier. Nevertheless, nevertheless, they're still compared, bedugmas. They're not actual spheres because the spheres won't emerge till after the Tzimtzum, but they have a similarity. Why? Because they're names. It's God allowing room that he would ultimately become this, that they would ultimately become the sphere of Chachma and Chesed. But now they're just names, named plural, because there's different attributes, but it's only the potential for these attributes. And we learned that these names are all encompassed and united in Shmoi, Shenikra Shem Echad, in that one name, one singular name. That's not yet broken down into different levels. So the divine energy before the Tzimtzum that is desiring and will ultimately be the source of the spheres is rooted in a level that's one name that's higher than Alei Sarotzen. So now we're seeing that the contemplation we spoke about before, speech into thought into the attributes to higher than Atzilus higher than Atzilus all the way before the Tzimtzum. Similarly, on a far more subtle level, the contemplation continues in Pre-Tzimtzum itself, in a much more subtle level now, because here you don't have all the structures, but within the divine energy before the Tzimtzum, you also have subtly, level by level, Alei Sarotzen, the Kalim and the Eris, the rooted, the many names in the one name. And then goes further. We're still not to the top. What's the next level? Then comes one higher level, Shmaya Atzmi. The way the name is encompassed in the source, here it's still a name, even one name is a revelation. At least there's a concept of revelation. Then comes Shmoya Atzmi, the Hainu B'chinas Etzem Ha'oir. This is Etzem Ha'oir that's not Oir at all. Ub'chinas Hashem Kamesha Kol Batzmusei. The Oir, the Etzem, the very core, the way, and the name, the way it's encompassed in the core, Mamish, B'chinas Yechelis. In that state, all the way in the state of Yechelis, God's capacity for all of this. So it's not even potential, it's God's capacity. Commission is bodily ill. Like we said earlier, the bottom of page 1420 and top of 1421 is where he elaborated on this before. So now the contemplation has taken on a whole new dimension of what you think about before the Tzimtzum. Now, as I explained a number of times, it may sound ostensibly, what's the difference between speech, thought, the attributes, and before Atzilus, and this that we're learning now all before the Tzimtzum? It's a tremendous difference, because before the Tzimtzum, nothing is existing. It's completely God revealing to us how he functions. After the Tzimtzum, it's true. These are high levels. It's God's speech and God's thought and God's energy, but it's at least in existence. It's already in existence. What we're talking is pre-existence. This is like talking about how it is before conception. After the Tzimtzum, you could say it's the one cell that encompasses everything. Here, we're not even talking about a cell. Nothing has emerged yet. There's no Tzimtzum. It's all within God, like essentially a child is born, so we can retrace that child into pregnancy, into that one cell that was conceived at the first moment of conception, when an egg was fertilized by a seed. But how is that child envisioned by God? The soul of the child before there was conception. We have no clue, because we have no empirical way of studying that state. It's not even come into a state of conception. But you have to say it was all planned in God's deepest levels. I'm just using it as an example. So pre-Tzimtzum would be like pre-existence. And post-Tzimtzum is within existence itself, expressed existence, speech, thought, attributes, as high as you can go, all the way to the before the Tzimtzum. Pre-Tzimtzum, you're talking about pre-existence, all understanding God on God's terms, but in God itself, sort of in the godly energy itself, there are these levels that help us move from structured existence, even within God's imagination, so to speak, all the way to states that are even before there's any structure altogether, it's in God's capacity. And all this, like he now concludes, and all this is the arichus, the elongated or the prolonged and extended echad. The b'chinas ha'achdus, and that's the word, mayrich be'echad. Actually a beautiful way of interpreting. You're mayrich, you're not just prolonging the word echad. The arichus in echad, that you are elaborating and embellishing and elaborating and expanding and understanding echad. What is echad? B'chinas ha'achdus the elemus. The achdus of the worlds, how they're united. At shorshan u'mekelim arishin, to their first and primordial root and source, or source and root, I should say, b'chinas ein sof yachid u'miyuchad. In ein sof, in the infinite divine, that is one singular, without yachid u'miyuchad is like absolute oneness. U'kameshin is barely ill, like we learned earlier again at the bottom of page 1420. The etzem ha'eru b'chinas yachid. That the level of etzem ha'eru is not just echad, it's yachid, singular. And for sure, the level higher than that, which is not even etzem ha'eru, but shmei kol batzmusei, what he called how the etzem is neisa, the capacity, the actualize, to produce oir. Etzem ha'oir is still from the perspective of oir, but it's not yet revealed, defined state. It's still as it is in its source. And then there's how the source, Shmei Kol Batzmusei, for sure, is a level of even higher, of total singularity and total echad. And all this is hamaydik be'echad. You've elaborated on and you've extended the contemplation on echad, and in every possible way, going from existence all the way into the source, since all maydik be'echad, all part of God's integral unity. Umemela, and therefore inevitably, or naturally. Mamela means, and therefore, as a result, so now we've established that the yichud and the elamis, the unity of the divine in existence, is not a second level. It's not like the higher levels you experience total unity, seamless unity. And the lower levels, you're just connecting. Existence was created by God. No, that highest level of yichud is mamish the yichud the elamis, like he said in the beginning when he began discussing this with the dibur, if I recall correctly. I'm just trying to go back to the words he used. Yeah. One second. I just want to find a certain expression I remember was very strong. Yeah. That's exactly the same unity. The yichud and the elamis b'chinas yachid mamish. Because you could argue there's different levels of unity, which is true. There's yichud tata, yichud ilah. There's looking at existence that exists and recognizing that God created existence. Or even further, recognize that God sustains existence, that God is the soul of existence. But then you come to realize, no, there's higher levels of unity where God is beyond existence. And here he's saying that that everything is now based on this contemplation is all the highest level of possible unity and seamless unity, below as above. Shal zeh nemar, yesh echad ve'en sheni lo. And this is what it says: there's one and no other, and no second to him. That's interpreted that there's no two unities, so to speak. Yesh echad ve'en sheni lo. Okay. So now he's concluded Hamayich be'echad. And now he's going to go back to Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah from page 1416. But before I continue, questions? Any questions, any comments, any points that need clarification?
So Rabbi, so when we're actually reciting the Shema, we should be like thinking about all these levels. I mean, is that what is that the goal here?
When the Frierdiker Rebbe would say Shema, it was usually, especially on Shabbos Yom, it was an hour and a half.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh wow, thank you.
So there are people who say Shema for hours. Yes, I would not suggest to anyone who's not done that to begin there. Why don't we begin with 5 minutes or 2 minutes?
Yeah, I think one minute would be good.
Okay, look, Rebbe Rashab is laying out how you run the marathon. But as we all know, unless you're conditioned, you're not going to be running a marathon for 22 miles without running first a mile. So my advice is, everyone has to find within this idea something to contemplate on. And then as you condition your brain muscles and your mind and your heart, you can then extend further. That's what I would say. But
in a way, it doesn't really make sense because, like, technically, like the proper way to daven Shmon Esrei is right at sunrise. Now, if you're davening Shema for an hour or so, you're not going to make that time.
Well, there were people I saw daven for 6 hours. So they say Shema before the time in the morning, so they make sure that the Zman Krishma is upheld.
But you can but you have to put on the talis.
They usually know minyan that davens 6 hours. And there's long discussions. There are people that daven all day. You're allowed to daven all day if you're on that level. You don't begin davening after noon, but if you begin 6 a.m. and you're going till 12 or 1 or 2, well, God bless you. Anyway, all type of things of halachic matters, I would always advise to speak to your local rabbi or authority that you respect if you have any questions regarding this. But you just want to know, there are chassidim that daven for many, many, many hours. Real davening is really connecting with God. Remember, what is higher than connecting to God? To go to eat lunch?
Well, if you include God in lunch, that's the real goal, see God in everything. But yeah.
Yeah, but we're talking here people who reach on this level. Again, this is called Avodas Atfila. You never heard of the idea of an Ovid who davened for hours and hours?
No, I did. I'm just saying, like technically, like there's a real big source to like davening Shmon Esrei right at sunrise, and like you're not gonna make that if you're davening Shema for an hour and 20 minutes when you gotta there's an earliest time you can put on tefillin and you need tefillin to daven Shema, so it just doesn't add up.
How many people do you know say Shemon Esrei at sunrise?
No, I'm talking about Shmon Esrei, not
I'm
Shema.
saying Shemon Esrei at sunrise. How many people do you know?
I like
The
anybody that's
majority of Jews who daven with a minyan don't daven at sunrise. So how do you explain that? Because it's not obligatory to do it. There is a schus. There's many schusim.
Well, you can also say a majority of people don't daven Shema for an hour and 20 minutes, right?
What's your point?
I think it's just clear. My point was, how do you make the Zman if you're davening Shema for an hour and 20 minutes? You can't make the Zman for sunrise. That's all. I'm not trying to get an argument. I just want.
There's no Zman. Shemon Esrei, it has a schus, as you put it. Only Shema has a time limit. Shemon Esrei you can daven at 11 o'clock too.
Not even Shema Esrei. You got to finish it by a certain time, according to whether you're going by the
As I
garage.
said, speak to your local rabbi. There's halachas about this. So what should I tell you? Yeah, you don't daven Shemon Esrei in the morning, at night. I understand, but there are. It's Zman Krishma is the real cutoff when it comes to Shema, not Shemon Esrei.
I don't
But
want to really take away.
bottom line
Okay.
is, there are people who are connected to God in a way they daven, and I wish you would be one of them, frankly. That yes, that connection far surpasses the merit of davening Shemon Esrei in the morning. That I will say. Anyway, let's move on here. Are there any other questions?
Yes, Rabbi Jacobson. First of all, I think one of the most presentation of all of Ayin Beis today. That's what my personal feel. I was just blown away how we went all the way up. It's incredible. A couple of things, a few things, my reaction. One is that this whole section has been, Arim Chaim Melech was talking about that whole 500 pages was primarily from Milamata Lamaila, right? Prayer. And now I thought we entered a section which was Milamata Lamata, Torah. But it seems like this whole discussion is still Milamata Lamaila. And the contemplation in Shema is definitely davening. So did the Rebbe go from Torah, how Torah reveals the Echad, the unity, Yichud in the world, from Torah's perspective, Milamata Lamata, to now we're talking about Milamata Lamaila?
Good question. The answer briefly is this, that even when he was speaking the 550 pages of Tefillah, there was plenty about Torah there as well. It wasn't exclusively Mat Lamaila, because they're always overlapping in many ways. And so it's not a surprise that he's talking here, going back and forth from Mailamata, then goes back to Mamat Lamaila. That's a general statement. More specifically, I think I pointed out, and I will definitely elaborate on this as we go further. In Torah itself, he's already established there's Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, Talmud, and explained Eira Makabel, Eira Mashpia. So in Torah itself, there's also Torah as it's given from above, and then there's so-called the Tefillah Shebet Torah, the Torah that we exert ourselves and we learn, and we through our Yigiyah, like he's speaking, the Shamas can even go higher than Torah. So there's that aspect as well, which is all going to come together, I hope. I'm definitely keeping in mind all the time that ultimately it is a combination of Tefillah and Torah. Each feels the other. It's like Tzadikim and Balei Tshuva. They're not mutually exclusive. We learned how Mashiach will cause Tzadikim to do Tshuva. Tshuva also needs the Avodah of Tzadikim. Tzadikim is Mamayel Lamata, Tshuva is Mamat Lamayel. So what I believe is happening here, when you look at the whole flow, in Torah itself, which began the subject, Torah, and he went to Riyah, if you remember, seeing. So there's the neshamas as they receive from Torah, Torah illuminates them, and there's the neshamas as they mashpia in Torah, and they go beyond Torah, which is really the ishin enei, the pupil of the eye, which is the etzem koyach hariyah, which is mamshich the hu of shmaya atzmi that we're learning now, the helama atzmi. So there's the helama atzmi as we reach it through from the bottom up in tefillah, which is really the core of the helama atzmi. There's the helama atzmi that we experience also in Torah through neshamas that are higher than Torah. So there's, besides the overlap I mentioned before, there's also this back and forth. So yes, what you're touching upon is something very much close to my thinking all the time. I'm always looking at how he's going to reconcile, and not reconcile is not the right word, how he's going to integrate these different approaches. So I would say he's talking about tefillah, that's for sure, Shema, Echad, but I think it's tefillah that is somewhat associated with Torah, because this is like where neshamas are being mashpia in Torah, that higher level, that Torah does not, that with Torah, which is mamayil lamata, but you're going to see he's going to go back and forth with this, far from over. I would love to believe that before we finish the Hemshech, that the Rebbe Rashab did not finish. We'll have clarity in this. But regardless, it's pretty clear as is, but it's going to get more clear. So we're in the middle of this subject matter. So you're touching upon a very central theme of Ayin Beis altogether. The idea of both, where they both come together here. So yes, we are definitely talking about tefillah here, but I think it's tefillah as it relates to Torah, as what tefillah, so to speak, contributes to Torah. That's how I would put it.
Great, thank you. My next question would be, I think you ended up with Shmo Kalo Be'atzmusei. Now, is that my question is, first of all, is that Shema Gadol that we talked about earlier? Is it lower level, higher level than that?
Higher. It looks like it's, well, Shema Gadol,
Shema Gadol.
it seems can be interpreted on several levels. Now, let's put it this way: there's Shemus plural. That's the 10 hidden spheres. There's Shem Echad, that's Shmei HaGadol, but I think in Shmei HaGadol there's different levels. The Shmei HaGadol, that's like Koydem Alei Saratzen. Then there's, let me see here. Then there's, if you look at the bottom, I'm looking at the bottom of 1420, where he talks about this. It's still Gilui. Then there's Etzem Ha'or. And then he says, Amitis in Shmaya Atzmi. So Shmaya Gadol, I think, refers to several levels. So the Shemesh, Shmay, then the Shmaya Atzmi, Etzem Ha'or, and then there's even a higher level, how the Etzem encompasses the potential for Or. And that's the highest level, Shmaya Atzmi. But I will point out, since you're already touching on it, it seems that there's two levels. One is where it's the Yechelis to give off Or, and then the Shmaya Atzmi, that's Helama Atzmi. That's even higher than Or altogether. It's not even Or, it's the power of concealment. So if you're going to really break it down.
So after Shmo Atzmi, isn't there two more levels? Hu, and then as you said, Helama Atzmi. The Shmo is still is Giloy Etzem.
So if you look on the page, on top of page 1421, he says Shmaya Atzmi is Hu Ushmai. Hu Shmai v'Shmai Hu. So that from the Shalah. So Hu is Etzem. Shmai is his capacity to express himself, but the Shmai itself, there's the expression, there's the core of the expression, there's the expression, the power of Hu to express himself. So it depends which place of Shmai you want to talk about. Shmai is on all those levels. But yes, Hu ultimately is higher than Shmai, if that's what you're asking.
Yes, that's what I'm asking. And one more step.
Helama Atzmi is a God, it's a God, is still not Hu, but it's rooted in Hu. So it depends. Remember, Hu we also discussed as Helam, Lashon Ister. So right. If you really talk about Atzmus Mamish is higher than Hu and Shmai and everything, just for the record.
Right.
Once you already say Hoya Hu, Shmai Bulvad, you're already speaking about something that you can talk about. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
But
Elias.
but we learned that it's directly connected with Atzmos, the shame, and from without any like different than all of the shamus, and I never quite understood that. And, now I think I understand it less.
Well, let's put it this way. Atzmus, in its purest form, I've always said, we only have three real words to describe that. Bilta mitzias nimtza, a non-existential existence. V'chuyev ha-mitzias, he must exist. And mitziusim atzmuse, that his existence comes from within himself. All of that has nothing to do with us. Completely exclusive to Atzmus. But the Atzmus has a capacity to do anything he wishes. The Alter Rebbe used the word Yechelis because he's looking desperately for some word that we can use, that just what's called a shachiches ha'ezen, something we can use to express something that's not pure Atzmus, and that is Atzmus' capacity, his capacity to do something. Yechelis, he calls that. That is what he's referring to, the highest levels, that where Shmaya Atzmi is rooted, the capacity. Now, there's a capacity to reveal, there's a capacity to conceal. In Atzmus, both capacities are one. And then they begin to take on two tracks at some point, which will ultimately be the beginnings of everything we're talking. Koydem alei saratzen. So you're talking about pure Atzmus, unless you really have learned a lot of Chassidus and spent thousands of hours, you're probably not speaking about Atzmus. You're probably speaking about Etzem Ha'or or Lifnei Tzimtzum. Because if you can't describe those completely beyond states, as soon as you describe anything, you're already talking about God in some form of description. In those descriptions, there are these levels that we're describing here. I've given many examples because you have to find something within yourself. Like I said, the difference between a child, a fetus, and the one cell upon conception. But then before the cell, there's the way that child is envisioned by the parents, but then there's no cell altogether. And as you go further and further, you go to more and more levels of abstraction. So the same thing with Seder Ishtalshlus. For many of us, just Asiyah Ruchnius is already pretty high. Asiyah Ruchnius, the spiritual of Asiyah, let alone Yitzira, Bria, Atzilus, before Atzilus, Ak, the Tzimtzum, before the Tzimtzum. So if you really want to do this real, I would need to hear from you. Tell me the difference between the spirituality of a blade of grass, and the spirituality as it is in Bria and Yitzira and Atzilus, before we start talking before the Tzimtzum. I think it'd be challenging to almost anyone who has not really worked on it to be able to explain in English, simple English. Tell me the difference between the divine energy within a blade of grass in Asiya, Yetzira, and Bria. And if you can't explain the difference, so what are we talking about before the Tzimtzum? We can't even understand it in plain spiritual worlds. So I'm not trying to in any way pull rank here or try to point out everybody's level of understanding, but you have to be honest with yourself. And here we're talking about before the Tzimtzum. Yet the Rebbe Rashab does give us oisius. He is telling us. That's why I constantly qualify. This is not easy material here. Because like I said, understanding Atzilus compared to Bria is itself quite. Alter Rebbe trembled. He couldn't even say the word Atzilus. Here we're talking about before the Tzimtzum. Imagine how much he wouldn't be able to express that. So, yet we still can find examples. And that's what I suggest you do. Because the only way you're going to understand these levels, if not, it becomes mathematical mechanics, and you're trying to place where's Shmaya Atzmi, where's this, where's that. You have to understand the Havana of it, the understanding of it. Is like when I speak about the artist envisioning the art he's going to create. That's a very, very important level. That's a God envisioning existence. What would be before he envisioned that level? What does it feel like? What's the experience of it like? Then you're talking about the Shmai that's more than shemesh. That's the shem echad. So you can imagine even that is so difficult to really fully figure out. And then as you go deeper, you're coming to understand the divine as is completely on God's terms. So it's really God's terms as he relates to us. Is it more the God's terms as he relates to us, or is it more us as we're relating to God? This is the language you have to find where you fit in, where you really can understand it well. I mean, I'm trying to explain it the best of my ability, but if you start going into these levels, you need to tell me what it means in simple English for me to help explain it, because just to place it, yes, I can give you. Atzmus, who, Shmoi, in Shmoi itself, the Shmoi HaKol Batzim, there's the Koyach of Helam Atzmi, Gili Atzmi, Etzem Ha'er, Dispashtus Gili Ha'er, Koydem Aleis HaRotzen, all before the Tzimtzum. These are just the levels I just spelled out. That's all the levels that he's been discussing here. If you may recall, the end of volume 2, and in Tzadik Daled, we discussed it also at length. So it requires a lot of contemplation here. 6 hours would not be enough even. If you want to do a real Hamayich Be'echad, based on what I just said now, you probably would need 6 months, if not more. Maybe a lifetime. Hamayich Be'echad, remember, doesn't say anywhere when you stop. It does say that when you contemplate an amlichte l'mayla l'mata dal zuchis, but I mean, technically speaking, how long does this contemplation go for? You could see yourself, we'd also have to employ hein v'ureisa tzimtzum on ourselves, or else this could be an endless contemplation. So I'm happy to discuss any of these levels, he gives the example of, like I said, remember how many times have I discussed the difference between revealed faculties, concealed faculties, keiches hiyulim, keiches atzmim, etzem ha-keiches, and nefesh neise keiches. We've discussed this many times because it's somewhat of an example to understand. Your faculty to write is rooted in a concealed place, which in turn is rooted in a core place, which is in return rooted in the soul, and the soul's capacity to carry that faculty. These are actual examples the Rebbe Rashab is using to understand all these levels. So I would look to find the corresponding level for each one of these. If you go back to top of page, bottom of 1420 and top of 1421 is where he laid out how it is with the keiches. It gives it a little more framework and structure. So if you have any specific question on any particular level, I'm happy to answer. What are your thoughts on what I just said?
I was just, I didn't even want to get to that, the depth that you're talking about. I just wanted to understand it at least superficially, and even less than geometric or mathematical. I just couldn't even.
So then go back to the example of the artist or the author before they even imagined the art they want to create. That's where you have to begin. That's an example. Then begins the first, remember we spoke about a person is not complete without a home. But you can live 20, 30, 40 years without a home. So there's stages of how something is embedded within you and you're not even aware of it. And then slowly there's stirrings of the beginnings, the genesis of something. And that in turn starts unfolding and developing further. That's the way I think is the easiest way to try to understand these levels here. And then if you tell me where you want, which level, I can tell you where to place it. I mean, it's not me. I mean, I just point out where Ayin Beis places it. So which level are you having, which, even superficially, I understand.
I just couldn't understand way before all these processes, way before Ales HaRotzon, that he would have a need for shame. That's maybe that's.
There's no need. Take out the word need.
No need or no desire for a shame, whatever you want to say.
So why not? A person is born with an innate need, a desire for a home. It takes, let's say, 20, 30 years, it starts emerging. And then you begin actually exploring. I mean, you could apply the same thing. Obviously, it's higher than time. So we're talking conceptual time. But you could understand stages before you wanted something is kaidem aleis haratzon. Aleis haratzon means you already arose in your desire. But there's a state before it arose in the desire, which is like an earlier state. Just because it didn't arise in your desire doesn't mean it's not there. It just means it's there, but it's not consciously there. Remember, consciousness itself and awareness itself and revelation itself are all created entities. God desires to desire. He desires to be aware. He desires to want to have a desire.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I just wanted to, you was talking about placement. So there's Atzilus and then Yeholis, you said. And then is it fair to say that who is the primordial source of the Kalim, and that Shmo is the primordial source of Or, and that when we say Baruch Hu uVaruch Shemoi, that we're including both the Kalim and Or at their most primordial level of Shema Atzmi and Hu Etzema Or? I mean,
It
not
may
Etzema
say
Or,
that in some
Helama Atzmi,
places.
Helama Atzmi, I'm sorry. Helama Atzmi. Well, who would be Helama Atzmi, the source of, in a revelation of that? Helama Atzmi and Etzem Or would be Shmo. Is that possible? Is that fair
In
to
some
say?
places in Chassidus it says that. I'm not sure how he's going to spell it out here in Ayin Beis. He's going to speak about it soon. But remember, who itself he's already defined in several places, different places. He first defined who, if you recall, who means something that's concealed. So it could be who that's not ata. And then I just want to see where he said. He said right here. 1 second. First he said who was save of Kalalman. And then if I recall correctly, where was it? Yeah. First he said who was Bina, and then he said that Ikar B'chinas who is Moiches Tima. So the fact is who can be placed in many different places. As far as what you're asking, I'm not sure yet. I don't want to say anything yet till the Rebbe Rashab himself spells it out. But who is Shmoi can be interpreted in a number of ways. If you go to Sefer Erchim, the Encyclopedia of Chassidus, he brings the different interpretations in the Erech Erein Sof. We talked about Hoyu Hu Shmoi Bilvad. And Ayin Beis, I'm not sure yet what the how he's going to explain who and Shmoi. I think it's going to come in the next few pages. The next page or two, if I recall correctly. But it's possible that who would be the root of Helam Atzmi, which is the root of containers, and Shmoi would be the root of Gilui. It's possible. It does appear so in a few of the expressions that he uses here.
Where was the source? I'm sorry. Where was the source that the Frierdiker Rebbe would spend 6 hours on Shema? Is it in Likutei Devarim somewhere? Or,
no, there are people that I didn't say 6. I said an hour and a half.
Oh, an hour and a half. Sorry.
I heard it from eyewitnesses. I didn't see it anywhere.
Okay.
Rosh Hashanah, especially.
I heard
Rebbe Rashab too.
I heard from an eyewitness that the Frierdiker Rebbe spent 4 hours on Shmon Esrei Rosh Hashanah, first night of Rosh Hashanah. So he was somebody who davened in his opinion. Yeah, the Shmon Esrei. Okay.
Yeah, I remember also there was this Skolena Rebbe that lived on Brooklyn Avenue, and his Shema was also over an hour. Not unheard of. I mean, I heard from people who were there. The tears and everything. I mean, I can't say every Shema. I just heard Rosh Hashanah for sure and some other times. I don't know everyone.
Well, now when you have this understanding of what it means to do Marich Be'echad, you can understand why that be certainly possible. to do.
Absolutely.
Yes. You certainly have changed, and this Sefer certainly changed my idea of what Marich Be'echad means. I always thought it was saying Dalit in the long way.
No. By the way, that there is a meaning like that too. That's a correct, it's just there are different explanations of Marich Be'echad. But the question is, why saying it long, even in what's the significance of that? Is the deeper reason is behind, because it means that you're concentrating on it. Let me just see one thing here. Yeah. I have to go back. The Who Shmai question, I have to go back and read it a few times. Not sure what he says exactly, but we'll get there. And I'm going to stop here. I think it's a good place to stop. The other questions? I'm going to stop at the end of the parentheses. Basically, 8 lines from the bottom of page 1423 by V'zeu Ha'ena. The only thing is he does say Shmaya Atzmi is Helama Atzmi. So I'm not sure if Shmaya Atzmi is who Shmai v'Shmai who, not sure. It's probably Shmai Kadim Kekadmuse. Look on top of page 1415. Discuss this somewhat there. Okay. So we'll stop here, bottom of page